Now moving on to our speaker today, Sovaida Ma'ani Ewing, who's appeared on our webinar series many times. She's an author, a speaker, and an international lawyer, a life mastery coach. I didn't know about that. Founding director of the Center for Peace and Global Governance, and you can easily go to that website and learn more about that organization. It's a virtual think tank and online forum that pools and proposes principled solutions to pressing global challenges. And she is getting gradually and more an international audience for that particular forum as well. Her latest book, Alchemy of Peace, spelled correctly, 6 essential shifts in mindsets and habits to achieve world peace. And she will, of course, be drawing from that book today in her presentation. She also hosts a video podcast, Reimagining Our World, and it's dedicated to creating a vision of the world that we want and infusing hope that we can make the choices necessary to attain that world. So without further ado, I will now turn everything over to Sovaida. Thank you, Sovaida, for joining us today. We're delighted to have you here, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Rob, for that very gracious introduction. Thank you for having me again. It's always a pleasure and delight to be here. And thank you to the audience for giving of your time so generously. All right, so the title of the book and the title of this presentation is The Alchemy of Peace. When we look at the world today, we see that, notice a couple of things straight off the bat. The first is that our world is beset by crises. Now, what's interesting about these crises is that they are increasing in number and kind over time. If you actually look back historically, you'll see that the number of crises is increasing. We now have a whole host of them. Many of them have now become existential. We've got climate change, we've got the pandemic, we've got the economic recession, the social unrest, threat of nuclear holocaust, unsustainable migration, and so on. You get the picture. The second thing we notice about these crises is that they're increasing in frequency. So if you take any given crisis like genocide or nuclear proliferation, you'll see over time that the number of occasions in which humanity has had to contend with the problem is increasing in frequency. The third thing we observe is that each time we have to contend with one of these global challenges, they are more intense in nature. So you look at climate change, for instance. Every year we see the numbers of wildfires and the intensity of the wildfires and the devastation that they wreak increasing. We see more incidences of floods and drought and hurricanes and extremes of weather, and the impact that it's having on humanity, which is escalating and increasing in intensity. What this reminds us of is the birth pangs, right, that a woman goes through when she's in labor. And this was aptly described by Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, when he said, "The whole earth is now in a state of pregnancy. The day is approaching when it will have yielded its noblest fruit." Now, at the same time as we see these crises, we also notice that our societal systems are unequal to the task of addressing our needs and meeting our challenges. Indeed, they're unraveling with a rapidity that is bewildering and accelerating. We see this in our political systems, economic, religious, environmental, you name it, pick a social system, and you will notice this disintegration and unraveling. The current governing body of the Baha'i faith, the Universal House of Justice, commented on this in 2019 in a letter it wrote, in which they said, "Thus do the forces of disintegration regroup and gain ground. So be it." And then they immediately thereafter said, which explains why the "so be it," the unification of humanity is unstoppable by any human force. Now, obviously, this is an article of faith for the Baha'is, that peace is inevitable. And And so this gives us the hope and the optimism to continue, even though there's this temporary rise in the disintegration that we see around us. Now, what we could conclude from these two observations is that our old behaviors are not working. Shoghi Effendi, who is the second authorized interpreter of Baha'u'llah's writings, says that if our old ways of doing things, in other words, our policies, our laws, our institutions, are not catering to our needs today and are not conducing to our well-being and happiness, we need to dispense with them. We should have the courage to do that. And he says, relegate them to the heap of obsolescent doctrines. Another way to think about the same thing, which is a technique we use in coaching, is that if we want our future to be different from our past, we have choices that we can make. In other words, we're not doomed to repeat our past. Who we are now as a human race is merely a snapshot of us in time and is not a predictor of who we will be in the future, which is a pitfall many people fall into. Oh, we've always been this way, we'll always continue to be that way. Well, you know what? If you think that way about yourself as an individual or society as a whole, you know, we might as well just shoot ourselves and put an end to it because there's no hope, right? But there is hope because we do have this amazing gift of free will choice. However, the question is, if you relegate these things to the rubbish bin of history, what do we replace them with? You can't leave a vacuum. So the first question is, what do we replace them with? And the second question is, how do we motivate ourselves and our fellow human beings to make the behavioral changes necessary? Because we all know that even when people are in distress, you can hand someone the best possible plan for getting them out of the mess they're in, and often they won't take it. So what do we need to do to motivate them? These are two subjects we are going to address today. Now, we can draw on the work of experts in behavioral change to get us going. They have a lot to teach us. The first thing they tell us is that if we want to make a change to our behaviors and habits, we have to begin by creating a shift in our mindset. In other words, the way we think. Why is that? Because our mindsets, it turns out, trigger our emotions, which in turn dictate our behaviors, either action or inaction. Those behaviors become habits, which when taken up by enough people in a wide enough geographic area become a culture. And that culture then determines our reality. So if we want to change our current reality, and we want to build a new world that is fit for purpose at this stage in humanity's collective development as it approaches its maturity, then we need to start with changing our mindsets. Now, another thing that these experts in behavioral change tell us is that by and large, humanity has two dominant mindsets. Individuals, if you look at them, or groups, fall into one of two categories. They either believe, oh, wow, I'm a victim of circumstances, I'm at the mercy of events, anything I do is therefore futile, and I'm helpless to change anything. One way to think about it is the message is, I lose. The other bucket is the category of people that says someone else is always to blame for the problem. I'm always right. I must always win at any cost. If I don't look out for myself, no one else will. In fact, others are out to take advantage of me. And you can sum this up with, I must always win. So either I lose or I win. Now, the dominant emotions they spawn are, the first category, the victims, are feeling despondent, depressed, fearful, anxious, worried, and helpless. We see this, and we see, for instance, anxiety and depression on the rise, especially during the pandemic. And we see the incidences, especially amongst young people, of the rise in these two phenomena. The second group of people who feel they always have to win are usually, it usually experience the emotions of anger, suspicion, and frustration. Those are their dominant emotions. Now, these two sets of emotions that were spawned from the two mindsets lead to certain harmful behaviors. What are they? Well, the victim-minded ones tend to dither, be plagued by indecision, lethargy, apathy. They tend to not act, and when they act too little too late. When you look at the pandemic, you see a good number of our leaders fell into that category of acting too little too late and dithering. Another set of behaviors is to be suspicious and to blame some group or another for all our problems. It's either the fault of the Asians or the immigrants or the Black folk or the middle-aged white men or some political party or another. It's always someone else's fault, but never ours. So both sets of behaviors exacerbate our problems and certainly don't solve them. And both have come to mark societal culture around the world. So now that we understand the power of mindset, it's important to understand and ask ourselves, what is a mindset and where does mindset come from? So mindset is essentially the lens through which we interpret and understand reality. It is comprised of our thoughts, our attitudes, our perspectives, essentially the stories we tell. These thoughts and beliefs are shaped by our past experiences, our family and societal cultures, our values, and a sense of who we are as human beings. They cause us to develop limiting beliefs, rules about how reality functions or should function, interpretations and narratives we repeat about who we are and what's happening and why it's happening, and false assumptions that just because things have happened a certain way in the past, they're going to happen the same way in the future. In effect, mindsets operate like the operating system in a computer. They tend to be hidden, unconscious, but drive our behaviors. Consequently, they dictate the range of choices we can see at any given moment, either restricted choices or expanded choices. Unfortunately, they generally make us myopic. In other words, create blind spots in us that cause us to fail to see the range of choices and answers, even though they are right under our noses. Now, the good news is that even a small shift in mindset can have a massive impact on our reality by spawning new habits. So another analogy is that of a pilot in an airplane. We know that the smallest shift in how you set the trajectory of that flight right at the beginning of a voyage, the shift in 1 or 2 degrees can make a huge difference in where you end up at the end, right? Either in the middle of the ocean or on firm ground. Now, imagine if one small shift in mindset can lead to huge impacts. Imagine what would happen if we had a series of small shifts in mindset. What a cumulative impact it would have. It was precisely because I was intrigued by the possibilities that this approach opens up that I was galvanized to write this book, The Alchemy of Peace. In it, I propose a new method that I call the Alchemy of Peace method that I want to introduce to you now. It's a simple method that we can apply to create a series of shifts in our collective energy as human beings that motivate us to make collective empowering choices in the form of systemic changes that will transform our reality and bring us the world that we want and deserve, a world that is characterized by peace, by justice, and by unity, and in which we can fulfill our individual and collective potential. Now, the Alchemy of Peace method is grounded in an understanding that change involves 3 steps. First, we have to stop and recognize and accept clearly exactly where we are and why and how we got here. What choices did we make that got us here? And recognize again that just because we're here now doesn't mean that we need to stay here in the future. I keep thinking of the topic of race relations in the United States and the process that so many of us have been going through, especially during this pandemic year and its aftermath, of really examining the institutional racism that has plagued this country and many others, and being clear-eyed about how we got here. What choices did we make that got us here? Do we want to continue to make those same choices? What different choices can we make that would lead us to a different reality that would make all of us happier and flourish more? Now, the second thing is, when making change, is we need to have a vision of where we want to arrive at. So we have to be very clear on where we're headed. Otherwise, we will just cast about making choices in random directions, never getting us anywhere in particular. The third is having determined where we are and how we got here and where we want to be, taking the steps to bridge the gap between here and there. The second thing about the Alchemy of Peace method that I want to acknowledge right up front is that I drew inspiration a lot from the divine teachings, particularly the teachings of the Baha'i faith. You know, one of the inestimable gifts that divine revelation brings to all of us is that it offers us a new set of lenses by which to perceive and understand reality. So it offers us a new set of mindsets to adopt, and it also offers us and encourages us to adopt a new set of habits that are more constructive and empowering, and that allow us to fulfill our potential as individuals and as a collective. For after all revelation, all religion, according to Baha'u'llah, is to bring about a transformation in the life of humanity that affects both its inner and outer life. He says that it shall manifest itself both outwardly and inwardly, that shall affect both its inner life and external conditions. Baha'u'llah also describes himself as a divine physician who has his finger on the pulse of humanity and knows what the remedies are to heal our particular needs today. To my mind, the remedies prescribed are a set of mindsets and a set of habits. We need a change of heart, a reframing of all our conceptions, and a new orientation of our activities. Another quote from the Baha'i writings. Now, what is the Alchemy of Peace? It essentially is a four-step process. Here are the four steps it comprises. The first is to bring to light the most prevalent and harmful encrusted mindsets and attitudes in the form of limiting beliefs, false assumptions, old narratives and interpretations about reality and about who we are. The second is to identify the outworn and dysfunctional habits spawned by the old mindsets. The third is to remove and replace the old mindset and replace it with new empowering ones that are in alignment with the vision of where we want to end up, right? The second step of change that we talked about. And the fourth is to remove and replace the dysfunctional habits with new constructive habits that are also in alignment with the vision of the future we want. So again, you see the importance of having a vision of where we want to end up. Because as you determine what new mindsets and habits we want, they have to be in alignment and consonant with the vision of the future. So an analogy that I like to use, it helps me remember how this works, is the following. You know, when you have a bacterial infection, in order to restore the body to healing, what do we do first? First, the doctor, the physician, gives us antibiotics to remove the bacterium. First, the doctor identifies that this particular bacterium is the problem, and then gives us antibiotics to remove it. So those are two of the steps. Then what do? We also are given probiotics, which are the healthy bacteria, so that the equilibrium in our microbiome can be restored to restore our immune system and therefore our bodies to full health. So the antibiotics is the removal of the old mindsets and habits. The probiotics is the injection, if you like, of new mindsets and constructive habits into our system to restore health. Now, let's look at the Alchemy of Peace method in action and see, well, you've been talking about this method. How does it actually work? And I wanted to take one of the mindsets and habits that I talk about in the book and share it with you so you see exactly how it works and how effective a system it is, even though it's very simple. And I want to apply it in the area of our conceptualization of power and the dysfunctional habit we have of electing unfit leaders. And the entire world seems to be plagued by and large with this habit. So we begin by accepting the reality of where we are. Trust in public institutions has plummeted to an all-time low. The Universal House of Justice, and again in 2019, said the failings of so many organizations and institutions of society have understandably led to a decline in public trust. Now, the path that we're on has been and is unsustainable. We have limped along, rationalizing our behavior, justifying it, and expending vast amounts of energy trying to maintain equilibrium in an increasingly turbulent and chaotic world. Yet we fail to take responsibility and actually change this reality. Shori Effendi says that the reason for the mess we're in today, including the pandemic, the nuclear danger that hangs over our head, climate change, etc., you name the problem. He says the reason for it all lies because of the failure of our leaders to adjust their system of economic and political institutions to the imperative needs of a rapidly evolving age. He says the problems are due primarily to the lamentable inability of the world's recognized leaders to read or write the signs of the times and to reshape the machinery of their respective governments according to the standard of the oneness of humanity that was adumbrated by Baha'u'llah in his writings. The Universal House of Justice, kind of developing this theme and kind of giving us a sense of where we are today, again, 2019, says that the realization of the oneness of humanity will require a historical feat of statesmanship. They call it for what it is, from the leaders of the world. And they say, alas, the will to attempt this feat is still wanting. So this is 2019. So, yes, it's wanting, and yet I say we simply can't afford to continue as we are before because the stakes are way too high. The twin impact of the phenomena of lack of trust plus failure of leadership is so grave that it now threatens in a way that we never saw before, that was always apparent, but we didn't kind of have the eyes to see it. It demonstrates that it threatens the lives of ordinary people everywhere. And we see this particularly as a result of the pandemic and the fallout from it. This indecision, the dithering, the half measures and acting against COVID, starting with not having enough personal protective equipment, not closing borders in time, not doing lockdowns in time, mask requirements, social distancing, and now the vaccine nationalism, which is, raging throughout the world, as bad as the pandemic itself, in a world that is so interconnected, that has become a single organism, we're still behaving as though each country can go it alone. It's crazy that as of end of March of this year, there were 30 countries that had 0 vaccines. The COVAX system has failed thus far. Only 2% of people in many countries, including in India, have been vaccinated, even though Indians, for instance, produce 60% of the world's vaccines. There's something desperately wrong with that picture. And what's become apparent, the reason I say that the stakes are too high is that this form of failure of leadership is going to cause harm in two different ways that we already know. The first is that even though wealthy countries who have been busy vaccinating their people think that they may be safe and that they can open up without further thought, the chances are that as this virus continues to rampage in reservoirs and communities that are unvaccinated around the world, new variants will come into being that will eventually evade the protection of the vaccine, which means that we then are back to square one. So it's not a smart move on our part. We're failing to see reality as it is. Then the second thing is that the economic devastation that has already been wrought, that's estimated to be $25 trillion, with half of the burden falling on rich nations, means that, we're all in this together. We are an interconnected humanity. We are like that ship with 193 cabins, as Kishore Mahbubani so famously said, this Singaporean diplomat. And the fate of the ship depends on who's at the helm of the ship. And unfortunately, there is no one at the global level right now to be at the helm of that ship. And our leaders are sorely failing us. Now, a second example of the fact that the stakes are too high and we can't continue is climate change. Climate change is already wreaking devastating consequences on the world. We talked about the wildfires. We talked about, the fact that the lungs of the earth, as forests like the Amazon and the Congo Basin and forests in Siberia, they're being devastated by these wildfires. We also have unprecedented floods and drought and people dying of famine in unprecedented ways and increasing extremes of all kinds of extreme weather phenomena. Countries are disappearing underwater. I mean, we're slowly boiling and we don't realize what's happening to us. And our leaders, again, have spectacularly failed. We should by now have had a global system in place that makes it very clear how much fossil fuel we can burn and how we can quickly draw down. We only have 9 years left till 2030 when we all turn into a pumpkin, essentially, when it comes to climate change. We should have had a plan in place with requirements imposed on nations. But instead, we have the Paris Climate Agreement that's based on a set of voluntary pledges that even if the nations follow through on their promises, which is a big question mark, it's not going far enough in order to forestall the worst disasters of climate change. And then we've got the threat of nuclear war. We have come very close to it, closer than we ever imagined. Lately, we've discovered, because of the release of formerly classified materials, both in the former Soviet republics and in the United States, that both during the Cuban Missile Crisis and also in 1958 in the Taiwan Straits, we came closer to nuclear detonations and nuclear war than any of us knew until quite recently. So we're playing Russian roulette, basically, with the nuclear threat. And because we've been so focused on the pandemic and climate change, we've kind of forgotten about the nuclear threat, and yet it poses a very real existential danger. Okay, now let's actually apply the Alchemy of Peace method to a reframing of our conception of power. Let's begin by acknowledging something that Abdu'l-Baha tells us in Secret of Divine Civilization. This is a work that he penned. He says that any agency, though it be the instrument of mankind's greatest good, is capable of misuse. And then he says its proper use or abuse depends on the degree of capacity, enlightenment, faith, honesty, devotion, etc., of the leaders of public opinion. So, not enough to craft perfect institutions. And I've worked in the area of global governance for 20 years now and have been advocating for the creation of all kinds of global supranational institutions that will take humanity to the next stage to satisfy and meet the needs that it faces and the challenges it faces at this step in its maturity. But it's not enough. We also have to do this other. Okay, so step one of the Alchemy of Peace method applied here, bringing to consciousness our old mindsets with respect to power. How do we view power and authority? Well, interestingly, we tend to believe that those in power seek to dominate and control us, and indeed are only interested in appropriating our precious resources for their own selfish ends. And given our history, it's not surprising that we feel that way and believe that. The second thing we tend to believe is that those in authority are driven by ego and motivated by self-interest. And the third thing we tend to believe is that those in authority, and this is really interesting, that they have a higher status or station than the rest of us, that they're somehow superior to us. Now, these mindsets tend to trigger certain emotions, the typical ones here being that we're very cynical about leaders and about the whole election process. We feel distrustful of those in positions of power and authority, and we feel helpless to change anything. So these are our dominant emotional reactions. Now, the habits that flow from this old mindset are really interesting. The chief among them is the habit of electing unfit leaders. But how does that happen? How do we end up electing unfit leaders? Well, because of a series of other dysfunctional habits flowing from this mindset. They include, we're really ambivalent about elections usually, and we prefer to sit them out. Consequently, we create a vacuum which we allow others to fill, and then we gripe about the result, which is crazy. We also tend to set very low standards for our leaders. We expect them to lie, cheat, and steal. When we do vote, we tend to elect unfit and unworthy leaders because our assumption is, well, that's what we've always gotten, that's what we're going to get, nothing's ever going to change. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Our leaders are incapable of meeting our needs today, and we see this in all countries. We need access to healthcare and education and shelter and safety and equal opportunity and lack of discrimination and all, the ability to live lives of dignity and meaning. We also need to be able to counter the challenges of climate change and the pandemic. So there are all these needs and challenges. These leaders are also unwilling to be truthful and transparent about the dangers we face, about the opportunities we have, about the various courses of action that are open to us and the consequences of our various decisions, like Brexit, where the British people were told by one side, you know what, if we exit the European Union, we'll save £340 million a week that we can then funnel into the National Health Service to make it stronger. Well, it turned out that it was a lie, that Britain was not giving £340 million a week to the EU. And indeed, what people had not been told was that a good chunk of the doctors and nurses in the NHS, the National Health Service, came from continental Europe, and a good fraction of them had to leave to go back to their home countries. So not only did the NHS not become stronger, it became weaker. These leaders that we elect are also incapable of creating unity of thought and a shared vision, like the importance of setting up a global virus surveillance network, which is something that's been proposed years before the pandemic, something that would help us to study these viruses that move from animals to humans and to help prepare us so that we wouldn't be caught flat-footed as we were with the COVID-19 pandemic. And the argument was it costs too much. Well, it would have cost a fraction of what we have now paid already to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. And once these leaders are in power, we're distrustful of them, which makes it even harder for them to unify us around a shared vision or get us going on shared action, which leaves us fractured, fragmented, and disunified. So what new empowering mindset, this is step 3 of the Alchemy of Peace method, what new conceptions of power and authority can we replace the old ones with? So here it gets really exciting. How about we start viewing power and authority as necessary elements of organizing society? The role of those in power being to create the necessary conditions that allow each of us to develop our potential and live meaningful and purposeful lives. What if we were to learn to associate words such as release, encourage, channel, guide, and enable with the concept of power and authority? And to recognize, as the Universal House of Justice said in a 2013 letter, that power is not a finite entity to be seized and jealously guarded, but rather that it constitutes a limitless capacity to transform in the human race as a body. What if we recognized that a leader's responsibility is to create unity of thought and action? A famous American entrepreneur, Ken Blanchard, famously said that the greatest leaders mobilize others by coalescing people around a shared vision. When I think of this quote, I think about the role that the Universal House of Justice plays in the Baha'i community. That's exactly what they do. They mobilize all of us by coalescing us around a shared vision in the form of the plans that they're constantly giving us and the guidance in the form of the letters and messages that they send. This creation of unity of thought is so important. Abraham Lincoln famously spoke of this. He said, in this country, the United States, public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Against it, nothing can succeed. And I think that this pandemic year has proven him to be correct. Abdu'l-Baha also talks a lot about the necessity of having a unified public opinion. In his work analyzing why Iran was facing the problems it did in the first part of the 20th century, he said the deficiencies in Iranian society have resulted from the total absence of a unified public opinion. And he said it wouldn't be until the people were educated and until public opinion was rightly focused that we would actually be able to that Iran would actually be able to overcome its problems. Now, another new way of thinking about power and authority is that leaders have the duty and indeed the privilege of serving. So unlike the old mindset that it's all about ego and self-interest, now we're flipping it. An analogy that I love to think about is that of a waterfall. You know, for all the sound and fury that the waterfall makes at the top when it's crashing on the rocks, the most powerful place is at the bottom in the reservoir where the water collects, the life-giving water. Another new way of thinking of power and the role of leaders is to recognize that leaders are merely fulfilling a function for which they are suited during a certain period of time that includes meeting the particular needs and challenges of that time. This is really important. So they're not better than us in any way. That's the old mindset, or are superior to us or have a superior status. No, they just happen to have the qualities that are necessary to fulfill a particular function at a particular time. An analogy here is that of an army. Not everyone can be a general and not everyone can be a soldier, but we need both. They both have very valuable roles to play, and it doesn't mean that one is better than the other. Another aspect of the new mindset around power and authority is that leaders should have the ability to take the long view and be proactive, to be able to address the problems of the day before they become emergencies. So we're not just reacting to the crisis of the day. COVID has been an amazing lesson in this regard. Despite all the warnings that were given to us that there was going to be an airborne virus that traveled from animals to human, we failed to take action and that would result in a pandemic. We were warned about this. And we failed to create that global virus surveillance network that I talked about that had been proposed. Now, yet another new feature of this new concept of power and of authority is that leaders have to be able to take people where they don't necessarily want to go, but ought to be. This comes from a statement famously articulated by Rosalind Carter, the wife of former President Jimmy Carter. in which he said, a great leader takes people where they don't necessarily want to go, but ought to be. And this is absolutely correct. Again, with COVID, we have seen this. What we needed everywhere were leaders who were able to give us the message clearly and emphatically, and convince us that we needed to mask early and often and social distance, and we needed to go into lockdowns for particular reasons, and what it would take to quash the virus. We need that with climate change. Leaders who tell us what the actual dangers are of climate change and what the opportunities are. We still have a window to tackle it more effectively. Abdu'l-Baha says, public opinion must be directed toward whatever is worthy of this day. And this is impossible, he says, except through the use of adequate arguments and the addressing of clear, comprehensive, and conclusive proofs. Because he says the helpless masses know nothing of the world. And though there's no doubt that they seek and long for their own happiness, yet ignorance like a heavy veil shuts them away from it. So again, the role of leaders is to elevate consciousness, give us information, be transparent, and bring us along. We've seen, by the way, the efficacy of this in dealing with vaccine hesitation, where in those places where leaders have been able to go out into their communities and engage leaders of religion, community leaders who are trusted, doctors, to talk to people and to create environments in which they can come in a safe place and get a vaccine, that people are more inclined to do it. So this is an example of leaders bringing others along and taking them to places that they may otherwise be fearful to go. So in sum, I like to say that I would recommend that we adopt a new definition of leadership to sum everything I've set up. And it comes from a statement articulated by another famous American entrepreneur and speaker, actually, Jim Rohn, who said, to lead others is to help them change their thoughts, beliefs, and actions for the better. So that's change their mindsets and habits, right? Another way of saying the same thing. So if we were to adopt the new mindset in step 3, step 4, what is the new habit that would flow from it? We would start to see that we would very naturally begin to demand as a habit that our leaders possess certain qualities of character. And these would be non-negotiable demands on our part as an enlightened electorate wherever we reside in the world. And what would these qualities of character be? Again, these are drawn from the Baha'i writings, particularly from Abdu'l-Baha's writings. So the first is honesty. Now, I say a very easy way to determine honesty of an individual who wants to be a leader or we're thinking of electing is to look at how they have treated their spouses and a family and their business partners or their employees. If they haven't been able to be faithful to the one person that they stood before God and pledged to be faithful for life, why should I, an elector whom they've never even met, why should they fulfill their promises to me? And why should I expect them to? I mean, shame on me if I fall for that. The same is true with business. If someone has demonstrated an inability to demonstrate integrity and to be honest in business, if they've embezzled funds or cheated their employees or whatever, then why would I expect, again, as an elector, to be treated any differently once I gave them even more power? Second quality, freedom from prejudice. What the world desperately needs are leaders who are unifiers as opposed to those who stoke the fires of hatred. So again, it's easy in the internet age today to do our research to find out what sort of person has this individual been. The third is the quality of courage. You know, there's a famous quote from the former Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Jean-Claude Juncker, speaking during the global economic crisis. In 2011, he said this. He says, we in Europe, we leaders know what to do to fix this problem, the crisis, but we don't know how to get ourselves elected or re-elected once we do it. Imagine that, as though this was about the leaders and their election. It's not about them. It's about them serving the best interests of their people. The next is freedom from corruption. So corruption is rife everywhere in the world. I don't think there's a single country that is completely free of the scourge of corruption. But one example that leaps to mind that's been written about a lot lately is that of Lebanon, that has suffered from decades of political corruption under all kinds of governments. And there have been many calls for its reform by the IMF and the UN, but they've gone unheeded. And now, as a result, 55% of the people of that country are poor. That is really horrific. And they're grappling with a web of economic and political crises that have led to rampant unemployment, skyrocketing prices, road closures by angry protesters, and a government with no clear plan to get the people out of it. And then to top it all off, there was that catastrophic explosion in the port of Beirut, right, in 2020 that left a large swath of the capital in ruins and only deepened the misery. And yet there was a butcher who was interviewed in the streets of Beirut who was quoted recently as saying, if there were elections tomorrow, the same people would be back. And this demonstrates our dysfunctional habit of electing unfit leaders. If this is the kind of consequence from electing these leaders, why on earth would the same people be back again? Now, willingness to listen to people in the spirit of humility and compassion and empathy are three other really important qualities that we don't talk about enough. But during COVID, it's become very apparent how critical they are, not just because they're nice qualities, but they're actually critical to the survival of the people in those nations whose leaders possess these qualities. And what's been interesting is that we've become aware that women leaders tend to be particularly strong in these qualities. We see this in New Zealand, where the Prime Minister of New Zealand has evinced these qualities. As a result, the people love her, and she managed to get her country out of the epidemic very, very quickly. Now, other qualities include wisdom and justice, which Abdu'l-Baha says are two mighty banners which will cause the influence of a government to quickly and easily penetrate the whole earth. And other qualities are individuals who seek means to achieving their ends that are as worthy as the ends themselves. Also, leaders who seek the broadest diversity of input possible. These are all really important qualities that we should demand, and leaders who evince an attitude of transparency. Now, I want to sound a caution here. I want to suggest that when we elect leaders, we be careful not to put the cart before the horse. We should focus on character and skills first and consider the proposed policies only second. In other words, we need to elect leaders trusting to their goodwill and their skill and their conscience and their ability to consult. Why? Because it's really important to allow our leaders the agility and the flexibility to adapt to the realities of the day, which we can't foresee. Abraham Lincoln famously said, "I never had a policy. I have just tried to do my best each and every day." And he clearly possessed those qualities that allowed him to grow and evolve his thinking and his actions over time to the point where he then was able to emancipate slaves in this country. So he came a long way until he got there, but he had the capacities and the capabilities. Because the truth is that despite all the promises that a candidate may make about the policies that they will implement, once the reality on the ground kicks in, things changed. As an old British Prime Minister, former one, said, Harold Macmillan, when asked what was likely to throw any government off course, he said, "Events, dear boy, events." A prime example that I chuckle about is when I think about today with Boris Johnson. When he was elected Prime Minister, he ran on a platform of getting Brexit done, and it was the reason why people voted him in. What nobody could have foreseen, and what ended up happening, was that he would have to deal with a global pandemic. He would have to deal with a global economic recession, the likes of which hadn't been seen since the Great Depression. He would have to account for his country's history of racism, and last, deal with Brexit as well. But other things would take precedence. So much more. This is, again, a real lesson. I mean, the poor guy wouldn't want to be in his shoes, but a really good example of the fact that we need to elect fit leaders who can then be agile and flexible and have the capacity to solve, and the tools and the techniques to tackle any crisis, no matter what it is. The second habit that we would develop as a result of this new mindset is checking what the motivations are of our would-be leaders. Simple question to ask is, are they motivated by money, status, influence, and power? Or do they desire to take into account and work for the collective interest of nations and the world as a whole? This is a really radically new revolutionary concept, I think, that Baha'u'llah has brought. You know, there is that statement of his in which he addresses the representatives of the people in every land. And he says, "Take ye counsel together, and let your concern be only for that which profiteth who? Mankind, not your own people." He's addressing the elected representatives of people in every land. So our members of Congress, our members of Parliament, our elected representatives, wherever we are. He says, "Let your concern be only for that which profiteth mankind, and bettereth the condition thereof." And today, when we see how interconnected and interdependent our world is, and how we have to contend with existential global threats like climate change, we see how it's imperative that our elected representatives, when making decisions about, you know, whether the coal industry should continue or what we should do to counter climate change, must have the good of all peoples in mind, and all nations, because the advantage of any one country, my country, can only be guaranteed by guaranteeing the advantage of the whole, because we have become one, this one interconnected organism. Now, simple technique for determining that our leaders have the requisite qualities and motivation is, again, we can research the internet and examine a prospective leader's record of service. So today it's become really easy to do. But there's one other thing we have to do. There is a skill that we need to hone once we have that information, and that is the ability to assess truth for ourselves without preconceived biases and prejudices. This is something that, again, the Baha'i writings talk about a lot. Many of you may be familiar with this famous quotation from Baha'u'llah in his Arabic Hidden Words, in which he urges us to see with our own eyes and not through the eyes of others, and to know of our own knowledge and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. And he says this is a sign of justice. So this is evidence of justice, of dealing justly with others and dealing fairly. So this is a tremendously important. And I just want to share that this requires a few things, including letting go of our entrenched habit of letting clergy and others tell us what to think. So we've got to now develop this habit for ourselves. Learning to assess information without preconceived biases, which means detaching ourselves from strong emotions, either likes or dislikes. Because when we either like something a lot or really dislike it a whole lot, we tend to avoid it or go towards it with blinders on. We also have to be able to think for ourselves and not be drowned out by opinion. And I was amused to see that, but heartened that somebody has, a Harvard person has written a book on the importance of learning to think for ourselves. I mean, it's that important, right? And people are starting to recognize it. We also need to be able to step outside our comfort zones and seek the views and opinions of others and not just stick with what we already know. And we have to be able to distinguish between what's information and fact versus opinion. This is a really important part of this skill of honing our ability to assess truth. And lastly, we have to avoid the pitfall of believing that truth lies somewhere in the middle of two opposing views. I go into this in more detail in a video podcast, episode 16 of Reimagining Our World. I'll share the YouTube link with you later. But if you're interested, I would urge you to go and take a look at it. It's about 20 minutes long. I want to end with this quotation from Abdu'l-Baha, in which he basically expresses this wish for us that we as Baha'is may make the world a new world, to the end that the old earth may disappear and the new earth appear, old ideas depart and new thoughts come. This is the mindsets piece. Old garments be cast aside and new garments put on. Ancient politics, this is habits, how we do things, whose foundation is war, be discarded, and modern politics founded on peace raise the standard of victory. Now, if you've liked the ideas here, and we've just focused on one set of mindsets and habits, and you're curious, what are the other 5 mindsets and habits that we need to identify and shift in order to create a peaceful world, I would invite you to pick up a copy of The Alchemy of Peace, my latest book, 6 Essential Shifts in Mindsets and Habits to Achieve World Peace. It's available at BahaiBookstore.com for those who are Baha'is and want to order that way, or on Amazon around the world, both in digital and soft copy form. And I also would invite you to join me for my live video podcasts, the 2nd and 4th Saturday of each month. It's called Reimagining Our World. The goal is to infuse hope in a society that is feeling hopeless and helpless. And you can join me live on Facebook or YouTube on the Center for Peace and Global Governance YouTube channel, which you can find on the website, cpgg.org. Just scroll to the bottom. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Sovaida. It was a fascinating presentation. And we may actually need to share the screen again, because sometimes we get questions based on the text that's up there. So we'll see whether we have any questions. At the moment, I don't see any comments or questions. But I, listening to your presentation, was wondering how we would bring about some of these changes, or how we would see even secular forces bringing them about. I mean, I think, for example, of your characterization of the problem of electing competent leaders, when we easily can have a situation where someone can say, well, since I'm a billionaire, clearly I'm a very effective leader. And then you really can't find out whether the person was paying their taxes, for example. You hear reports that the person's not paying this contractor or that contractor, but you can't really verify the information. So I think one of the big problems we have nowadays is verifying whether someone is honest, verifying whether someone has the best interests of others in mind. And the media, as much as it tries to help, often will sometimes spread misinformation or propaganda. And certainly through social media, as we know, we've discovered, I think in the last 5 or 6 years in particular, the immense power of social media to mislead, to create reality, shall we say, that's not really there. So in many ways, I wonder how we would bring about some of these changes. And I know this is, of course, a huge problem and a huge issue, so I don't know if I can really answer. I don't know if you can answer the question very well, but...
Well, you raise a really good point, that there's so much distortion these days. It is very hard to parse through and to sift through the information to verify what is true or not. And yet, what is happening is that I think if we were to focus on, the record of service of individuals speaks a lot about who they are. So if they're engaged in community service, if they have been demonstrably engaged in, for instance, tearing down the barriers against racism, in uplifting people from marginalized groups, in doing good, that in itself will often tell you a lot about the kind of human being they are. So for myself, of course, each individual has to make their own judgments. But when you start to smell a lot of smoke, I tend to assume, well, there probably is some kind of fire. I may not be able to discern exactly the nature of that fire, but if there's enough chitter chatter from various sources, so an array of sources about somebody's supposed misbehavior, then I just err on the side of caution and say, you know what, maybe I'll give it a pass. So this is not something that's going to be resolved overnight. What I find very exciting is that people are starting to have conversations and to raise consciousness on the importance of looking for qualities in individuals. I remember 10 years ago, even talking to friends of mine about just writ large, the importance when electing our leaders of looking at their qualities of character. And to a person, it didn't matter which political party they hailed from. It was like, Sovaida, that doesn't matter. We just look at their policies and what the promises are that they're making.
Yeah.
And now that story is starting to change. We're starting to see that actually looking for qualities of character is important, and it will come over time. Another shift that's happening is that people are starting to actually have serious conversations about the need to abolish political parties, right? Partisanship. Again, this was a conversation that even 7 years ago, nobody was willing to have. It's like the system has worked well enough. Let's not tinker with it. But now you're starting to hear people write articles and talk about the fact that, you know what, maybe it is time to get rid of political parties. So having these conversations for me is the first important step, right? To as I say, to lift the veil and bring to light old dysfunctional mindsets and habits and propose what's possible in the future.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think it's extremely complicated. Like I said, you mentioned the principle of where there's smoke, there's fire. But part of the difficulty right now with the misinformation systems that are going on out there is that people run around spreading smoke and saying, look, there's smoke. Yeah. When in fact, they're spreading the smoke and then accusing the other side. Yeah. I think we see that really quite well about the whole issue of election reform right now. And so I often have wondered whether we wouldn't have a more effective political system if we started at, shall we say, the neighborhood level and had electing amongst 500 people, one delegate.
Yes.
And then those delegates getting together and electing the city council and, going to a state convention and electing or district convention for a congressional district and electing a congressman instead of it being all direct election from the people. Because if you're looking for votes, majority of votes out of 500,000 people, you can spend a heck of a lot of money fooling people.
I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. And to that extent, I think that the Baha'i administrative order really provides a good pattern for this. I guess we believe it's going to be the nucleus and the pattern for a new order that will emerge over time. And it's a laboratory in which we ourselves are experimenting right now and learning. And it seems to work very well. Exactly right. Because if you start at the neighborhood level, you know the people, right? It's not a question. And yeah. So
and you can't, and no one's gonna be spending more than $100 on their campaigns, and they can go door to door. And if you get everybody together in a picnic a couple of times a year, and everybody's shaking hands with everybody else and getting on each other's Facebook pages or whatever, you get a big sense of exactly who in your neighborhood is interested in doing what, if you really want to. But some people won't bother even then, but at least the people who are then, or the person or persons then chosen, are probably a little more concerned or discerning, and therefore are able, when they get together with 400 or 500 other delegates, to get a better sense of who among the delegates. I don't know. It's an interesting problem. It's a really interesting problem.
It is. It's something we need to continue thinking about and experimenting with, and throwing more ideas into the mix. And there's definitely a desperate desire for a different system. I just recently came across something the Danes do, which I find fascinating, and that reminded me a little bit of the Baha'i system, in the sense that they want to get to know their leaders better and to have input from the grassroots. So apparently once a year, they gather together on this island off the coast of Denmark. There is a massive festival, open air festival, which is usually attended by about 150,000 people. Anybody can go if you can get yourself to the island, and all the leaders of both corporate leaders and political leaders are there, and they're dressed informally, and they walk around these tents, and there are various talks, and there's a lot of eating and drinking and dancing, but people get to ask them directly, why did you do this? Here's what we think you should do. Here are our concerns. And I thought about the beauty of the Baha'i administrative order with the 19-day feasts, right? Where every 19 days, every individual and every Baha'i community, from a village in Africa to, a city in Denmark to South America, Asia, wherever we are, including children, get to have input and talk to their locally elected representatives about what their concerns are, what their hopes are, what their desires are. It's amazing, right? And so, but it's again a sign of what's possible. What is possible.
And it's also a sign, I think, for what we don't have in the United States, which is that sense of community. Mm-hmm. I remember I was in Seville, Spain for 6 months back in the year 2000. It's a city of 750,000 people. It's not a little place. And we would be walking down the street with some Spanish friends who lived on the other side of town. And every 10 minutes or so, they'd run into someone on the sidewalk they knew. And I'm thinking, you live, 3 kilometers from here. How do you know the people here? Oh, well, yes. And I was constantly amazed by, in spite of that enormous size of that city, the networks that seemed to exist that don't exist generally in the United States. In some ways they do if you're plugged into them, but they're different. There are social action networks. There are networks of civil rights organizations, of organizations to assist people. And if you're plugged into those, you're plugged into a kind of network, but frequently people aren't plugged into those. And in Seville, they have a fair every year that goes for an entire week, and the schools shut down and everybody takes a vacation, and they go to the fair at noon and they stay there until midnight practically every day. And every neighborhood has its own, they call them casetas. They're like little pavilion. And so you go to your caseta and you eat and you drink and you sing and you dance. And then when you're tired of that, you go to somebody else's caseta and you eat and you drink and you sing and you dance.
Okay. Yeah.
And they do it for a week.
Yeah.
So
they know how to celebrate. I was there over Easter one year, and it's amazing. Everybody poured out into the streets. In fact, you had to be really careful because you'd get stuck in the flow of traffic going down. We couldn't get back to our hotel. We had to go round and round and round in circles like a maze in order to find a side street that didn't have a crush of people in it going in the wrong
that's
direction.
Easter. That's really true at Easter time. But again, we have nothing like that except for maybe the 4th of July or Memorial Day parade, which goes for an hour and then everybody dissipates.
That's right.
And that kind of community life is really essential for building better communities.
I totally agree. I miss it. I mean, growing up in Africa and the Middle East, both those experiences were marked by a sense of community life that once I went to England and then came to the United States, I found distinctly absent.
Now, to some extent, that's because of our greater diversity. Because having a more monolithic culture does generate some of those ties. But clearly, we can create those ties with diversity as well if we're creative and if we develop the cultural sensitivity to do it. So
I think it's because we also move around more. So it's one of the reasons I chose to stay in Washington, D.C. 34 years. So I have a lot of that experience that you talked about, bumping into people I know in D.C., no matter where I am. Because over the years, I've belonged to several different communities. I was at 3 different law firms. I worked for the government. My daughter was at 3 different schools, each of which have huge communities. And I find that I can hardly ever step out to go anywhere, even driving, 10, 15 minutes without bumping into somebody I know and stopping for a chat. And I love that. It's one of the reasons I chose to stay here. So it's doable.
Yeah. And there are certain places you can go where, as you develop a network, you will run into people. Here, it's the movie theaters if you're looking for the young people. And it's the farmers market if you're looking for older people.
Right. Fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll tend to run into them in those places frequently. We don't have any other comments or questions at the moment. Let's see if anybody has anything else. One person does say, how can you choose effective leaders if you can't find anyone good enough?
So I guess we have to start by acknowledging that we don't live in a perfect world. It's definitely imperfect, and it's not going to get perfect anytime soon. And we still, the whole system is flawed. The whole system of nominations, of campaigning, of the kinds of people who are drawn, the role that money plays in elections. We've got to really start reflecting on all of these, because I think the people most fit to be leaders wouldn't ever dream of running because they view the system as so corrupt in so many ways, including what you alluded to, Rob, which is people creating smoke and then blowing it in your direction. And so these are, this gives rise to a whole bunch of other questions, which I didn't have the time to deal with today, but that's right. And ultimately, most of us end up, choosing the lesser of 2 evils. But what a horrible term. We've all learned to say this over the years. Oh, I'm choosing the lesser of 2 evils. Yep. You were talking about our well-being, and COVID has now demonstrated the absolute importance of getting our house in order on this front, because otherwise people are going to die. I mean, it's no longer just a nicety. And climate change and all these other major decisions we have to make. So yes, good point, Boyd.
Yeah, I wonder whether some of these other election reform techniques that have been proposed, like what do they call it? Ranked tier voting.
Ranked choice voting. Yeah.
Ranked choice voting, where several states, Alaska and Maine, have both adopted it already. And it allows people to indicate their first, second, third, fourth, fifth, however many choices there are. Right. They can put their choices in order.
Yep.
And they therefore can vote for as many political parties, for example, or as many candidates as they want to. and they don't have to worry about someone being elected they absolutely can't stand as much, because they can make it clear that that's not their choice, I guess you could say. So,
well, yeah, what's interesting about that, and I did one of my Reimagining Our World series on this, we discussed this, is that your vote always counts in the end result. So the normal system is, well, if you didn't happen to be part of the majority, then your vote just doesn't count, right? But here, because you indicate your preferences, if no one person gets a majority, then you take the last person, and whoever voted for them as their first choice, you then take that person's second preference and allocate that vote to their second preference. And you keep doing this until one person gets the majority. And so you get past this extreme polarization. And everybody knows that their vote ended up counting, which is amazing, right? So, and many cities in the United States, I was surprised at the number of cities who use ranked choice voting, and the number of states has increased now. So I think that it may very well be one of those stepping stones. As I say, we are starting to think about these things, and we're going to start experimenting. And that's what I find so exciting about it. Not that ranked choice voting itself is a panacea, but the fact that we're willing to start trying different things in order to get past disunity in its egregious form. That's what's exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, and we found that some of the other electoral reforms, I think California set things up so that the two candidates you vote for a particular office are chosen amongst a primary, which can involve anybody. So it could be two Republicans or two Democrats running against each other in the fall election, and that way you don't have a situation where 10% of the population is absolutely determined that their particular person becomes one of the two candidates. It could be 30% of the people or 40% of the people who want someone from the whole spectrum, and it tended to move the elections towards the middle, I gather. So things like that also are in some ways very simple changes that can at least help. But obviously, we're talking about a lot of education of the public.
Exactly.
And that's
time to start, like now.
Yeah. Well, obviously, it's going to be a very, very difficult process because, again, there's so much misinformation that now can be spread around. I mean, just look at how COVID-19 has been politicized, and science behind wearing masks, the science behind vaccination isn't trusted by a large number of people because of the misinformation. One person I know of, in fact, said that I'm not going to take the vaccine because they say you can't have children afterwards. It damages your ability to have children. I'm thinking, what?
Yeah.
No. Yeah. That's not correct.
Yeah. It's amazing what's out there. Yeah. It's sad. But I think it's also giving us an opportunity to evolve and grow, because we're going to see the fallout from this, right? And so this is in and of itself an opportunity to learn.
Yeah.
And to start to learn to hone that skill.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you very much for your presentation today. And I want to thank our audience for joining us. Also, it was a very good discussion about a fascinating topic. And I'm looking forward to looking at your book and seeing the other aspects of the alchemy listed there, and see what else we can do. So again, I want to remind everyone that we will have a fascinating presentation looking at the teachings of the peacemaker Dagon Awida and comparing them to Baha'u'llah's teachings in the Most Holy Book next week. And that, I think, should be particularly attractive to a lot of thoughtful people. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I want to wish you all the best over the next week in your service to humanity. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.